Uh, is it recording now? Am I
Yep.
listening for the message? Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name's Brianna. I go by she, her, or they, them pronouns, Brianna or Bree, and I am the current manager for Visitor Experience here at SFMOMA.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Mishak. I'm the current director of Visitor Experience at SFMOMA. And today we are here to talk about training staff and engaging staff from home.
So just a little bit of information about us. Both of us started for SFMOMA at the same time in 2016. I started as kind of the entry-level front desk person, information desk, ticket selling, all of that kind of stuff.
And me and Bree have the same start date. I started as the assistant manager, one of 3 assistant managers in the visitor experience department as a part of our museum reopening team. I started as an assistant manager, and then right before COVID hit, I was promoted to manager of visitor engagement and just recently promoted to director of visitor experience. Staff ready to come back into a building. Staff haven't necessarily worked in months, so not only are we training on practices that we would have already been, they would have already known, but we're also training for a pandemic and what to expect, in a new COVID world. And then, what can be done in a large, we can't be in the big theater like we were in the previous slide, but what can we do as a group to still keep the kind of team morale up while acknowledging that we were in a pandemic? So what we did was have weekly brainstorm sessions as a management team. We looked at ways of identifying core competencies that we wanted to address while we, address these situations. Some things that we knew we needed to do was refresh everyone who hadn't worked, be prepared for new hires, be prepared for needing to go suddenly because we didn't know when we were going to have to reopen, because obviously things were always shifty. And then we needed to identify ways of getting things done virtually while staff were at home, and identifying those items that can be done virtually always, because we were using this time to revamp our training in kind of a hybrid fashion. And then what were going to be the COVID policies and procedures that we needed to go with for safety. We identified that we needed to solve for some logistics. So thinking about does every staff member currently have a computer at home to do training virtually? Do they need to borrow a tablet from the museum? Do we have staff that might need to go into the museum because they're not comfortable with technology? Who's there? Who's going to be with them so that they can make sure that they are getting the everything they need out of our training? We knew that there were some folks that that just did not like doing things virtually. How can we address those things? So what we did was, in our brainstorming sessions, we just made sure that we identified everything. We tried to take hours to identify all of the gaps and play devil's advocate with all of the ideas, so that way we were keeping everything in mind. Some other things that we thought about when we were doing this was, what are some other departments that we would want to share training moments with, or that we knew that we would want to train, use our training. So thinking about our security partners, though visitor experience is the biggest department on our front line, we also have museum store partners that we might want to include in this training, and other teams that like that are vendors that may come up that we didn't necessarily think about. So those were some things that definitely needed to be thought out and identify some challenges as we were thinking through this process.
So after we had really gone through and listed all of those challenges and looked at kind of what were the issues we're dealing with, what kind of staff trained, like what's the problem? We let that kind of become the goals. So looking at, our goal was to shorten the training time needed. One of our goals was to include more other departments, like Nicole had mentioned. And the next step after that was to just straight up build an outline. We went through and listed every kind of subsection of work that we deal with. And really looked at how to divide the materials that we were training in different ways that made sense. So looking at smaller segments like emergency and security. Here on the screen, you can see kind of a little subsection of our probably 5-page outline that we ended up making. We needed to train on ticketing information. We need to train on accessibility practices. Our coat check, tours, customer service standards, brand standards, all of these kind of smaller things. And we just kept it really rough. There's always time to go back in and add more later, erase details, all of that kind of stuff. But we started with just the very rough basic outline, looking at the headlines and then filling in everything later. And breaking it up into these smaller chunks really helped us narrow down and find all of the gaps that we had had in our training beforehand. So for example, we had been training how to deal with the coat check, but we had never been training people on what to do if somebody lost their tag and is trying to pick up an item. So just like small gaps that really made a big difference in our floor operations. And as we were going through that outline and starting to fill in a little bit more, we really identified that we needed to leave room for change. And this is, I think, one of the things that has been the most helpful in building this training. We went through and identified areas that change often or may need to change in the future and isolated them from other training materials so that it would be easier to change that. So, thinking of brand identity, when the remodel happened, SFMOMA also changed their brand. So we went from this black logo to the new red one. So it's changed once, it might change in the future. So being able to separate out that whole brand training section was a big deal. We also know that, accessibility best practices change often. Our sales strategies, how we're talking about memberships, how we're talking about our tickets, those change often. So being able to pull those out from things that don't change as much, like our scheduling system or our payroll system, those are kind of pretty static for us. Also keeping in mind that planning for and training for change makes the change later down the road a lot easier to deal with. So when we're thinking about in the training materials for accessibility best practices, we actually mention, this is what we know now. It may change in the future. Be ready for that. And it just makes a really more accepting mindset among the team. So they're ready for it to change. They know it might be coming. And that has been kind of one of our biggest gains from doing this new training program.
Absolutely. Speaking of change, during our closure, we also merged departments with our on-site membership team. So as we were building this new way of thinking about training in the visitor experience side, midway through, we were told we are all now one team, and now we needed to include the membership team. So with that being said, it's super important to make sure that things are general enough to where you can't, the work you're doing doesn't have to stop and completely be scratched. So that was really good about what Bree was just saying, to keep things pretty vague, or if this is what happens today, we don't know what's happening tomorrow. With that being said, building the training based on your company culture, your organization's culture is super important. We thought, we'd use this time because, again, we were closed for about 10 months. We took the first 3 months to really brainstorm and think outside the box. So in our brainstorming, we were thinking about what is the package that we want current hires and new hires to have within our new training. So things like, what does a welcome letter look like? What's the cadence of the welcome letter? When do they get the welcome letter for new hires? Team building moments. What is staff engagement for to bring on new staff and old staff so that they can mingle and know each other? Is this something that we can do now as we're in this, shelter in place with current staff so that they don't lose, faith that will never come back? And then, something that we did in 2016 that we all thought was pretty amazing that our HR department led was they gave us a list of local restaurants for just so if you want to go out for lunch or if you want to do, have a team building exercise, you can do that. Obviously, during COVID, we could not do that, but still, it's something that we like to, even today, keep that list up to date, just so we can tell staff like, hey, your favorite cafe reopened, or maybe this is their new hours. And then for our new hires, it's just good for everyone to know what's around. We also created a checklist for ourselves of things to think about when we were building this training. What are things that staff, new hires specifically, and all staff, what are some things that they need to have by a specific date to make sure that they are indeed being brought along on the onboarding and integrated holistically in the SFMOMA brand and culture consistently. This checklist really helped us identify moments of who was going to do what, who would be meeting with these associates, things that we thought we needed to consider is how do we as a department make visitors, make staff and new, current and new onboarding. How do we want them to feel when they come on to come into our department? So we, in our own internal department, started asking things like, please let us know what your preferred pronouns are if you're comfortable. Please let us let us know a little bit more about you, so that way we felt like you feel like we care, because we do care. We figured that including things like accessibility routes and different ways, different informational moments in the emails and training, and setting expectations early really helped with bringing folks on. We wanted to make sure that there wasn't a kind of COVID onboarding when we reopened to staff who maybe came in and they came in to help us with our reopening, but didn't feel like they were integrated in the department as a whole. So that culture piece also, is just really important. With that, it was important for us to not put all this work on one person. Pre-COVID, we did have this kind of, like I said, Bree really liked training, so it was like, Bree's our trainer, and that's not sustainable for Bree. We have to spread the love. We all need to know what Bree does so Bree can take vacation. So we really took those brainstorming moments, in those checklists, divided and conquered, and said this section makes more sense being done by the director. This section makes more sense being done by the manager. So that way that all staff know that everyone on the management team is involved in their onboarding and in their continued development with the department. There were moments when we had to just figure hey, this is a lot. Planning this out looks like it's going to take a whole day versus a couple of hours. What can we turn into a handout versus a presentation? What can we turn into a quick check-in versus a larger meeting? Moments like that really helped us kind of divide and conquer and build a bigger, get more done in a more efficient way than kind of a stagnant way. We typically in our department do 2 hiring rounds a year, one in the holidays, so fall, winter, and this just gets us through our holiday rush. Typically these are temporary hires, and then another pre-COVID, it would be our surcharge summer rush. Now we did just bring on two folks to help, a few folks just to help us get through the summer hours. Long term, we're not sure what that will look like, but we were able to try this out, and I'm happy to say that this did go pretty well for the last two cohorts that we brought in.
And then, so from this section, we really had the trainings prepared and everything. So then we moved into looking at, how do we make the training itself more accessible? So thinking about, what is the best learning environment for staff? And really, people learn best from a mix of seeing, hearing, and doing. So, you may hear people talk about, kinesthetic learners that learn by doing, or people who learn best by taking notes. And the reality is that everybody learns best if they get all three in there. So building in checkpoints in the training itself to say, okay, it's your third day, you've had these sessions, this is the information you should know now. It's 2 weeks into your role here with us, you should know this much. And then making sure to touch base frequently actually during those training periods. So actually sitting down with a manager, if you do one-on-ones at your organization, this would be separate from the one-on-one. This would be specifically to check in about how's your training going? Do you still have any questions? Have you made it through the checklist? And then also just assessing, Nicole mentioned it earlier, but how accessible is the training itself? We were looking at, having staff do some of this training at home in a virtual environment, hopping onto a Zoom meeting to do some of the training. Do they have computers at home? Do they have Wi-Fi access at home? We have some people on our team that don't like computers and they don't have Wi-Fi at home. So we needed to make sure to have an accommodation for them or have a way for them to access this training in person at the museum. Making sure that your slides are high contrast and easy to read, making sure that you have transcriptions or a written option in case you have anyone on your team who's hard of hearing or deaf. Just looking at, making sure that your training that you're creating has an easy way to become accessible for anybody who needs it that way. And, really, it sounds like making it accessible could be a lot, but it's just knowing what you have to change or what you have to adapt in case it's needed. So, a lot of our trainings turned out being videos that we've recorded information for. When recording that, we wrote out scripts of what the person doing the audio recording would say. That script can just become the transcript that we could provide for somebody who's hard of hearing. So we worked it into the way that we were building the training so that we wouldn't have to do a lot of work later to make it more accessible. And then just practice, doing it over and over again. Every single time that I give a training, I find a gap. I say, oh, I forgot to talk about this, or, oh, this isn't in the training. So you will find gaps, and making it part of the process can be really rewarding. So I let the staff know, hey, this is a fairly new training for us. Make sure to look for gaps. Let me know if you find anything didn't quite work out the way that it was provided in the training. And creating easy feedback methods to improve the training. So it's not just about like, okay, your training, this is the only time to talk to me about how the training worked. But in those check-ins and touch bases that I would do with staff, I ask, okay, it's been 2 weeks since you've been here. Thinking back on your training, was there anything that you found missing? Was there anything that you wish you had learned in the first week that you didn't? And really like kind of normalizing the not knowing, letting people know that like, hey, even me as the manager, I'm not an expert in these topics also. So I may not know something. I don't know, what I don't know can't go in the training. So you have to let me know that it's not going right. And then also just a good tip that I found is that it can be hard to retrain current staff to come to them and say, hey, we have a new training, you have to take it. I know you already know how to do the job, but you have to take it anyway. So instead, I made reviewing the new training materials the way to retrain current staff. So basically saying, hey, we've done this new training that we're going to give new hires. I want you to take it and let me know if there's anything not right or if there's anything missing. So that way it's reviewing the training, they're retraining themselves by taking it, and they're paying more attention to it and going, okay, well, what would a new hire know? What do I want to tell my future coworkers? Instead of just going through it like, oh, I already know this, I'm going to skip this. And it really helped to engage staff in the process and actually give really good feedback. And it just kind of took some of the extra review off of my shoulders. The management team didn't have to spend an extra couple of days reviewing our training materials. We just gave it to staff and they did it for us. And so that was a really great kind of addition and tip that I would pass on to anyone.
So Bree talked a lot about the accessibility portion, and I know we talked about the hybrid method of in-person and virtual. So to do virtual, we realized that at some point we couldn't be we had to be in separate meetings to prepare to reopen our building, and so that way we knew what was happening and what day we were going to reopen. So we looked at training platforms. And with that helped us decide, like, we can upload trainings, we can assign to staff, and make sure that they could do it even in the shelter in place fashion, while still at their own leisure. So we took another moment to brainstorm and just to find the right platform. There's plenty of platforms out there. We researched so many different ones, but before we chose a platform, we did take out a list of must-haves and brainstorm things that, like, what do we want from this platform? Because of course not everything is free or cheap. So some questions that we asked ourselves were, what are some extras that we want from this platform? How user-friendly is it? How often will we need to access this platform? So is this something that we're only asking staff to do once a month, or is it something that they can do more frequently or log into more frequently? And how much time is it on the manager to really manage the system, if you will? I would say in this moment, it was really important for us to get the feedback from all managers and any supervisors that would be supporting the running of the platform. We looked at what platforms gave us the ability to upload quizzes and track progress, provide discussion spaces. So did we want to have trainings that maybe we didn't want to do a full meeting for just for time's sake, but maybe there were moments where we can check, have a knowledge check or do a discussion board. So all of those things and more did get us to the point where we decided at one point to use two different platforms, Teachable and then LinkedIn Learning. I will say, be realistic about budget when you're thinking about integrating a new e-learning system. For us, we were lucky because we didn't spend any money by the time we had closed as a department, so we had some money, some leftover funds to kind of just play with before the end of the fiscal year. Some things for us that got us to that point, we looked at Teachable because it did have some of our sister colleagues in the Bay Area were also using it. And it did have the functionality of you being able to do upload a PowerPoint and track performance and do quizzes. And LinkedIn Learning was important because we also wanted to make sure that we were engaging staff on a kind of a professional development basis, so that they were still feeling like we were invested in them, even though we weren't with them every day, but we still cared about that they were getting the knowledge that they needed. we have since stopped using Teachable. Next slide, Bree. One of the reasons why, the technical stuff. Once you find that platform, be sure that you have the staff, or if you don't have the staff, or if it's something that your staff doesn't feel like managing, it may not be the right platform for you. How easy is it to add new users or fix login errors? How many different ways is there to log into the same system? And is that the login going to help you get to help the staff member get to where they need? Does it have an app? Again, going back to technology, maybe some folks really like iPads versus computers or desktops. Can they do it on their phone? How easy is it to upload content? Don't forget that you also need to train your staff on how to use the platform. So how easy, user-friendly is the platform? Reporting might be easy, but it may not be easy on an everyday usage basis. So we quickly found that though Teachable did the things that we needed it to do, we didn't have the time to necessarily manage the system on the back end to constantly use it. So what we have done so far is we are pausing on Teachable, and we've only solely started using LinkedIn Learning because it did have the same functionality with the additional learning and professional development learnings that we wanted staff to have. Something else I would add is this platform something that you would want to use pre and post, like during COVID life and then after COVID life? What we were asked to open pretty quickly, reopen our doors once in October, and then we closed a couple months later, and then reopened again in March. Both times we had a perfectly planned training matrix that we had to cut. So is this system something that you can use when you're back in your building during day-to-day things, on the floor, off the floor? And that's something we also realized, that it might be easier just to go to one system versus having the two. You're on mute, Bree.
Thank you. There was a large truck passing with its horn blaring. So we were really looking at a couple of different systems, and we had actually kind of started talking about potentially moving digital with our training before COVID hit. So our HR department here uses M-Train for some of their, sexual harassment courses and those kind of things. And M-Train was looking at developing a system where the user could upload training content as well. And so we had kind of started engaging and talking about that. But by the time we needed something, M-Train still wasn't quite there. And so, we did settle on Teachable. We were using LinkedIn Learning as well. But kind of what we've found is that you could also just use, your Google Drive or Microsoft Teams account if you have that. What we ended up doing to actually produce the videos that we were uploading to those platforms is PowerPoint has an option to record audio onto the slides, and then you can just save the PowerPoint as a video. So we just did that and then uploaded the video. It really didn't need any special equipment or anything like that. It was just me sitting at home talking into my headset, hoping that my cat doesn't start meowing. We also recorded some of our trainings that we had. We had a couple of talks from curators, and we just recorded that and turned that into a training on, the art that's on that floor that they were talking about. You can go really, really simple with this digital training platform as well. We really like the LinkedIn Learning platform because it does have those additional, no manager effort professional development courses. Like if somebody needs to know more about how to do Excel, they can just look up an Excel class on LinkedIn Learning without any effort from us as the management team. But when it comes to our in-house trainings, PowerPoint was still the best. And there's also some really convenient screen capture tools that exist out there. You can just, I just did a quick Google search for free screen capture tools and found a couple that were really good. So when we're going to hopefully move into turning our ticketing systems training into a digital format, and we can just use that screen capture to record a video of our screen as we're doing a transaction on it. So these are just some suggestions. I'd really, take the time with your team if you're looking at going digital to really assess, are these things that people are going to be only doing on site? So they're going to be using your resources, your computers to access them. Is it something that they're going to be doing on their own at home or something like that? And just really figuring out like how quickly can you onboard somebody into one of these programs. We found that for new hires, it was actually kind of clunky to get them up onto Teachable because you have to send them like a whole separate instruction email about how to log into Teachable and what to look for and how to do it. Whereas, LinkedIn Learning, most people are already familiar with it. So these are just some of the suggestions that we looked through, but there's definitely a lot more out there that you can take a look at. And really, we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but really the next step is to evaluate the system. So we did, it probably was a little bit less than a 6 months, but we were looking at these two systems that we were using, Teachable, which is the icon here, and LinkedIn Learning. And we were looking at, what's effective, what is working, what's not working. Are staff actually retaining the information that we're giving them? Is the training that we're providing them actually matching up with how operations are working on the floor? We kind of found that a variety of things were happening. Mostly people were retaining the information, but it was also so much information at once about all of the COVID policy updates, all of our department merger updates, all of these things that were happening. And so, we needed to expand on some areas that we hadn't thought of before. We also found that the reality that we prepared for didn't quite work. We thought we would have a lot more lines for the ticketing desks than we did have. We thought some exhibitions would be more popular than they were. Other exhibitions were way more popular than we thought they were going to be. So there was just a lot of like shifting and adapting what the training materials actually were in that first 6 months. And also we found that Teachable was just not sustainable for us as managers. We didn't have somebody to specifically assign to managing our account with them. And so staff were having a lot of login issues that, we'd say, okay, I'll get back to you. I'll figure it out. And then, 5 days later, I figured it out and the staff person was delayed on their training. So, take that first 6 months, really see what's working. We were hoping that maybe like some of the login issues would drop off, but they didn't. They kind of persisted, which ultimately led to us switching over to just the one platform.
So, Bree mentioned about like, it did take us a little bit less than 6 months to know that Teachable wouldn't necessarily be the best fit for us, but we did sign a year contract, so we kept it. But we recommend at least reviewing any training material yearly, if not more. Assess best practices, review the old policy, review the training platform, just taking a holistic review moment to just make sure that everything is still holistic and needed for you and your team. It's important to stay on top of that, just because it's really tricky and hard if you only do it during your hiring time, because you won't be able to really give it a holistic review and you'll be rushed. Something that we just recently started doing, I started with all the managers doing a monthly curriculum review meeting where we just review curriculum to make sure that it is up to date. obviously with COVID and different, needs that we just have on our team, because we are, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. Things are changing with new mandates and stuff. It doesn't, we want to make sure that we're ready and that our training is still relevant. So every month we do an 1.5-hour meeting just to take a deeper dive into a policy, and we will see if it still works and if that training is still relevant. It allows us to make sure that, again, we're just on top of things. Sometimes we may not need it, but it does allow us to just keep eyes on it. I would say that the time that we took during COVID, though it was sad to be away from the building for so long, this beautiful moment of having new training, really taking some time to review the training and see what worked and what didn't work was a beneficial and the flower that was birthed out of COVID, because our team is definitely benefiting from the change. And with that being said, does anyone have any questions?
So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here so I can actually see what's going on, but feel free to drop questions in the chat, or I believe there's a Q&A feature. So feel free to drop your questions there as well. Question from the chat: how did you manage your department changes with other departments? I think we were kind of in a unique situation because we were kind of the only department that was going through these really big, changes at the time. We were dealing with a lot of institutional and organizational changes. So we just kind of focused on what we needed to do in order to be the best, provide the best customer service that we could. And once other departments were in a position where we could reach out to them, then we started reaching out and saying like, okay, we want to get a curator in to talk about this. We want to get somebody from our education department to talk about this. We want to start involving people in our morning meetings. Most of those staff still aren't in the building yet, so we're, still working out some of the logistics. Nicole, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that?
I would say it varied. To piggyback off of what Bree is saying, we definitely not being in the same building, there was a slight pause that we were all able to kind of take and just say like, we'll worry about that tomorrow or worry about that later. But at the time, in my role at the time, it was I made sure that we just stayed in contact with folks as much as possible. And made sure that even if it was something that we didn't have the bandwidth to talk to them about or have them come to any of our meetings at that moment, it would still be on their radar. And then during this time, I started to do a weekly email with the team. So that way staff knew what was happening, even if we weren't talking to them every day. And in that, it also had things about other departments. So if it was something about, hey, this show is on pause, or this activation may or may not happen when we reopen, just those moments really helped keep everyone connected. And, it's something where, when we weren't in the building at all and everybody was working from home, I think there was a small sense of appreciation that folks were still working so hard to get us back in the building. And then once we got back in the building, well, that was tricky because some of us were in the building and others were not. So the communication channels just changed, and we had to manage those relationships a bit different. Good question.
Any other questions? Yeah, I would definitely say the success factor was effective communication. We really had to figure out how to maintain effective communication, especially since some of our staff didn't have a way to join the meetings from at home, or, weren't checking their emails frequently. Um, so we went through a couple different trial runs of like, how often do we meet? How often do we talk to people? How often do we keep them in touch? Um, I think it was also complicated by the factor that, you know, we have all of our positions changed a little bit. Our director at the time left as we were going into our second reopening. And then, Nicole moved into the director position. I moved into a manager position. So it was our membership department merged with us. It was all over the place for a little bit. It felt very chaotic. And we managed to keep the communication channels open and engaged throughout it. Um,
Um,
so follow up, we are currently going through some similar changes. Any suggestions on how to make this type of change while operating at full capacity?
communicate. It's literally the saving grace to everything. It was something that even during our mergers with our on-site membership team, um, it saved, I will say it saved our butts a lot, because even if there was someone that didn't read an email or didn't show up to a meeting, they still we still can always fall back on it. And I think even for the management team, it helped us keep kind of a diary or a journal entry, if you will, of what was happening that week. And making sure that in your communication there is some consistency to it. So we landed on every Thursday at 9 a.m. this email went out. We all reviewed it. Wednesday, up until Wednesday morning or Wednesday night, and we timed it so it went out at 9 a.m. So staff knew that was happening. We shared our training matrix. They knew that they had, calendar, like the calendar invites. Everything was so kind of overly planned out, but in a way that staff could feel like they were still involved, and managers wouldn't go completely crazy. But it still allowed us to maintain control in a moment where there was really no control. Since we've been reopened, we are also at full capacity. We're still going through department changes. This cadence has continued, and it's allowed us staff to just know, like, okay, no matter what, we will get an update at this moment. No matter what, this information will be shared with us. Is it going to make everybody happy? No, because as we know, we can't make everybody happy, but it is something that also helps us from an HR perspective, because it is consistent communication. Something that we didn't talk about, we are in a union environment at SFMOMA, so that does always play a factor in the things that we can and cannot do for the team, and maintaining constant communication is obviously a factor that we had to be methodical about, and how we did it with the team pre-closure, closure, and being open full capacity. So it just helps us keep that flow.
And to be frank, we got very comfortable saying, we don't know yet, but we'll get
Yeah.
back to you. And
TBD.
It was actually, staff were, understanding of that a lot more than I think we thought of going in. A lot of staff were just got used to hearing that response and understanding that we were working with them to figure out the answers. And in the training, we would add in moments of, this is what it is now, but be prepared for it to change, so that we could say, like, this is what we're thinking of. This may not be what it actually looks like, but we want to keep you informed of what's going on. So not waiting for that 100% finalized perfect product, but instead just, keeping them involved in the actual change instead of trying to deliver something and saying it was right and then having to go back on it later.
We got really comfortable with being gritty. Any other questions?
I will say I forgot to add our emails to the end of the presentation here. So I'm going to put mine here in the chat. So if you do have any questions that you think of, thank you, Pat. We've got 10 minutes left. So if you do think of any questions or, want to know a little bit more about kind of the process that we went through or any of the platforms that we looked at, feel free to reach out to myself or Nicole. Both of our emails are in the chat. We're happy to answer questions or just talk about training like Nicole mentioned.
Yeah.
I love training, so I'm always happy to go through things.
Or if anything just comes up.
And some of the things that we didn't mention is that we also did a complete new DEI trainings and anti-harassment and trainings and all of that for our staff during this as well. So we were adding new parts of the training in and dealing with a lot of fun stuff.
We did use this time to also supplement our training with a visitor experience handbook for our team, which we again went through the same process and brainstormed and figured out what we were trying to solve for, and came up, Bree, wrote this, what was it, 25 pages of just information that we have since kind of dwindled down to, I think, 8 to 10 pages. But it gives kind of like a holistic overview of our department, what it means, but it also helps the team know kind of, guidelines and stuff. So that way we don't have to retrain that all the time. So that's an example of one of the handouts that we switched one of our trainings into be a handout. So if you ever want to talk training, handbooks, anything, our information is in the chat.
So we'll stick around if you have any questions for a couple of minutes, but otherwise feel free to head out and grab a couple minutes before the next session. Thank you all for coming.
Guys.
It's not actually the 5-minute warning, but I already pasted it in the chat. So there's all the links to the next sessions for anyone who's looking for that 5 o'clock block, and hopefully y'all come and join us for Battle Decks later. Thank you both for presenting, and